And welcome to season 2, episode 6 of the QCast. I have a returning guest here with me today that I'm very, very excited about, and that is Mike Schauer, the chair of the Men's Basketball National Committee, and of course, the head men's basketball coach of the 6th ranked Wheaton Thunder. And Mike, my first question to you, are you impressed that I wore orange for you today?
You know what? I did not notice that, Bob, but thank you. It looks very good on you. I would like to tell you, you will not usually see me in green. I don't know that I can reciprocate that, but I do appreciate that. I hadn't noticed that, but that looks good.
Anything for my guests, Mike, anything for my guests. And in all seriousness, I hope you're doing great. We last spoke, gosh, it was about 8 months ago, right after the season. And, we've got games that have been played. I watched the Titans yesterday. There were fans in the stands. The band was there. Before we get into this conversation, are you feeling a lot better today than you were 12 months ago today?
Yeah, clearly. So like you, I've been to watch some games. I was in person for a couple games, which I told my wife, that's the first in-person D3 game I've been to where I was not a participant since the Oshkosh North Central NCAA tournament game. Wow. in March of 2020. So
that's amazing.
It's exciting to be talking about this sort of stuff in our season and regional rankings and national calls and all the stuff we're going to dive into, as opposed to whether or not we're even going to have a tournament. Excited to move forward, really excited to be back in Fort Wayne. We were fortunate to be there in 2019 as a Final Four team. It's a tremendous experience. Excited to get teams back there, and just optimistic about a season and excited to be going again and feeling some semblance of normalcy. It's not perfect, but it certainly feels more so than it did a year ago at this time.
Absolutely. A year ago, we were kind of waiting for different schools and leagues to cancel and just trying to figure out if there'd be a season and all these things. So today, I appreciate you joining me. And while we could talk about your team, your 6th ranked Thunder, for about 2 hours if we wanted to, today we're going to keep this to your role as the National Committee Chair, because I tell you, I have a similar story to you, in that you have always told me that, several years ago, you were one of the coaches that was kind of the squeaky wheel, and why does it work this way and why does it work that way? And Mike McGrath told you, hey, you need to get involved. You should get involved. And that's the process through which you learned how all this stuff works. And I would say, as a fan, 15, 20 years ago, I was the squeaky wheel too. I was the one that said, I just watched this game and that team looks better than that team. Why did they get in? And it wasn't really till I committed to understanding the process that I found I could make a credible argument. And so we're similar in that regard. In your National Committee Chair role, I would like to spend this time today helping people understand the selection process. Let's just call it like selection and seating 101. And so people understand how this all works. Does that sound like a fair format for today?
I think that's great and would be helpful, because I think not only, I think there are coaches, and myself would have been included in that don't fully understand how the process works. We can disagree whether it's the right process, but I think an understanding is really valuable. So I think this is something hopefully people can find of use and can refer back to it as the season progresses.
So let's start just a change that's hit this year, which is a change in regions. So we used to have 8 regions that everyone's familiar with, the Northeast, the Mid-Atlantic, the South, Central, et cetera. And we've moved to 10 regions now. Now, these regions, I don't think have any kind of slick names yet. I think it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Like the CCIW is in region 8. I think we're even using like Roman numerals possibly. I don't know, but the move to the 10 regions. So your thoughts on that first? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? What's your take on how that impacts men's basketball?
Yeah, great question. So as you know, nothing really happens in a sport specific way at Division III. Things happen across the sport board, if you will. And so the regional realignment took place on a national level across most sports. And the reason simply was a disproportionate number of teams in some regions as opposed to others. Certain schools were in multiple regions for different sports. So it's an effort to realign regions so that we, one, reduce or make it closer the number of teams in each region. The old men's basketball ranking, I may get the numbers wrong here, but The Northeast was up into the high 60s of teams, and the East region was in the mid to high 30s. So there was a significant difference in the number of teams in each of those regions. So I think the region realignment had to happen. Whether you felt like we could have done that in the 8 regions by simply moving some teams, or whether we needed to expand to 10, I think that's open for some discussion. But again, if we look at it just through the men's basketball lens, it kind of misses the point of Division III. I'm not sure basketball needed to go to 10 regions. I think there are sports that probably did. So I'm perfectly comfortable with it. But we now have 10 regions. We're going to be ranking more teams. We're going to be ranking 80 teams now, which is a significant number of our Division III teams will be ranked. But it balances the number of teams in each region and how many will be ranked. It'll be a little bit closer. The gap won't be quite as big from region to region in terms of number of teams ranked.
You make an important point that these decisions are not made in the vacuum of everyone's favorite sport. So like me posting on the chat board that the Wisconsin Intercollegiate and CCIW should be split up out of the Central. That's not really how these things are decided. These are across all sports that these decisions are made. Fair to say?
Not only fair, but 100% accurate.
Let's talk then. Let's get into a little bit of the selection criteria. And this is where we get into things that it's important that anyone that wants to take this seriously and anyone that wants to have a credible argument as we get into January, February, March about how teams are selected and seeded, you've got to understand that there is a very black and white process. And then within that process, there is a lot of debate and discussion. So I want to focus first, Mike, on the primary selection criteria. And there's 5 things listed in the championship manual. This stuff is out there. You can go out there and see it. This isn't a hidden thing. It's out there for everyone to see. So let me read off the 5 criteria, and then we can talk through this in a little more detail. Win-loss percentage versus Division III opponents, Division III head-to-head, results versus common Division III opponents, results versus regionally ranked Division III opponents from the prior week, regionally ranked the week before, and Division III SOS. The first thing I'll point out to people is that I said the word Division III in all 5 of those. So let's start with the primary criteria, Mike. First important thing is games against Division III are all that counts in the primary criteria. Talk through that a little bit. Any thoughts you have on the 5 primary criteria?
Yeah, so well said, Bob. I think the thing is sometimes people get in discussion with me and they debate whether the criteria is good or bad. And that's a different conversation, which I'm certainly willing to have at any time anybody would like to have it. But at this point, that isn't really the conversation. This is the 5 primary criteria. And it is what the committee, the men's basketball committee, will use. And in essence, the only thing we will use to pick our 20 at-large bid teams. And so an understanding of that is pretty paramount. So a couple things I would tell you about the criteria that people sometimes miss. One is the first criteria is winning percentage. And so it's not total wins. It's not results against Division III opponents. It's winning percentage. However, from there, the next categories start to refer to results. So it's results against regionally ranked opponents. It's results against common opponents, not winning percentage. So that means the winning percentage overall is more valuable than total number of wins, as opposed to the other criteria that are results. So 2-0 in regionally ranked wins is probably not as good as 4-4 against regionally ranked wins. I say probably because it matters who those 2 and those 4 are, but so that's one area sometimes people get confused is one category is true percentage. The other one is results, which could just simply measure wins, quality of wins. It's a bit more, there's a bit more ambiguity to what results means as opposed to winning percentage, which is just a number. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would tell you is the one category that people most often overlook that really becomes a significant category is results versus common opponents, because it's a little difficult to find that information if you are sort of a novice at it. We obviously have, the NCAA gives us that information. And so you may have a game that took place that is a bit of an outlier, that somebody is on a trip, a national trip, and all of a sudden Illinois Wesleyan plays Williams in a tournament. Well, that result could end up cascading down through the process, because that result, a common opponent results could rise up. So, a couple of years ago, Benedictine had a win against North Central, and North Central went on to be very good in our league. Well, anytime you compared Benedictine to anybody in the CCIW, that win against North Central brought every other result into play, because it's an interesting category that a lot of people overlook, and that can really be a significant category. The other thing about that category is people rightly recognize that conference finished is not a criteria. And yet it's under results versus common opponents where your conference standings come into play. Because obviously, if you compare Illinois Wesleyan and Wheaton, we'll have our head-to-head contest, and then we're going to have a ton of common opponents, most of which are going to be in the CCIW. So that is often, when I talk to people, a category that people overlook, because it's hard to be honest, it's hard to sometimes get that the totality, because you have such outlier games going on. So that would be a significant criteria. The other thing, if you allow me, Bob, I can actually give you some of the percentages and numbers. Please. If you're following your team and you go, well, how many wins do we have to have? What's our SOS numbers? So we've accumulated sort of the averages over the years. And so your winning percentage really needs to be above 70%. Are there examples of teams below that? Yes, but they are few and far between. The vast majority are over 70%. And on average, Bob, the average is 21-6. So that's the average. It's a 79% winning percentage for Pool C people over the last several years. So that's the average. So if you're looking at winning percentage, you've got to be somewhere between 70 and 80% to really be considered. Obviously, head-to-head speaks for itself. We don't need to talk about that one. Results versus common opponents, again, that's a little bit varied depending upon the comparison. Your SOS, the average SOS of a Pool C team is 0.550. That is the average. So if you're looking to say, hey, what's my SOS got to be? It's got to be somewhere in that realm. And then, Bob, you've got to have at least 2 regionally ranked wins. 3 is, you start to get to 3. Anybody with 4 is going to have a significant number. But those regionally ranked wins, carry a lot of weight. They're like gold chips because there aren't very many of them. And if you have 3, 4 of them, 5 of them, you're gonna have on your resume something the vast majority of the country is simply not going to have. So that's how I would break down the 5 primary criteria, and not necessarily what we're looking for, but what history would suggest you need to be a true Pool C candidate.
Yeah, great information. I don't think I've ever heard it spelled out with that much data behind it, and that tracks with, I think, what we've seen over the years. You've got to be at 70% winning percentage. Usually, now there's some outliers. I think a couple WIAC teams have gotten in the last 5-6 years with 660, 670, somewhere in there. But to your point, when you went down the rest of the criteria, those teams that had the 660 or 670 had some off the charts numbers.
Yes. In
results versus regionally ranked, the common opponent stuff. So it's all a balance. Those were outliers. But in those situations down at the final Pool C pick, they had some numbers that jumped off the page. Just a reminder, these are Division III games. So like, I'm going to give an example from yesterday. Yeshiva played an NAI team, Penn State something or other. That game pretty much is like it didn't happen. It's a real game for them. It counts. They're 2-0. But that game isn't going to be a game that factors into their resume come Selection Sunday. Is that accurate?
100% accurate. You could suggest it may make an appearance in secondary criteria, which I'm assuming we'll get to next. But the truth of the matter is it almost never does. So in essence, in functional reality, it will not count.
In terms of the weighting of the primary criteria, I think the answer is there's not an official weighting. It seems like, though, that win-loss percentage is sort of the first thing. Like, you got to have a good win-loss percentage in order to start going down the rest of the list. Is that accurate? I mean, that's fair to say, right?
Totally fair to say. And the way I would articulate the balance of it, and I'm going to kind of jump into secondary criteria here because I think to do the broad. So, the secondary criteria is non-conference SOS. It's results versus non-Division III opponents and results versus common non-Division III opponents. And those other two almost never come into play, right, Bob? So it's really, in essence, functionally, Your secondary criteria is non-conference SOS. And that only comes into play, and I'll use the vernacular of the committee. We talk about first page, which is the 5 primary criteria. And if you can't determine a winner between 2 teams on the front page, the first page, we move to the second page, which really then the first thing we look at is non-conference SOS. So what I tell people, because I get asked all the time, what do we need to do to increase our chances at an NCAA bid? You first, winning percentage is the baseline. There will be enough teams around the country with a .700 or better winning percentage that you have to have that. Now, the ones that don't, the ones you talked about, they had 4, 5, 6 reaching the ranked wins and an SOS over .66 or .600. Those were exceptional resumes outside of the winning percentage. So you have to have a baseline number of wins. But by default, the SOS ends up becoming pretty important, not because the committee values it, but because the criteria values it, because your SOS will get counted both in your regular season SOS, but also your non-conference SOS becomes really significant. So when people ask me, what do you need to do? The gold standard, the thing you can get that not many people have is if you can get a regionally ranked non-conference win. If you can get that is something the other teams with that winning percentage, not very many of them are going to have it. And so a non-conference win against a regionally ranked opponent, Bob, checks every box. And so I always tell people, if you're looking what you can control to the best of your ability, I know there are teams out there that by geography can't do this, and that's a difficult situation. But I can. There's no reason for me not to play a good schedule, literally none, unless I don't feel like my team is good enough. But I need to go play good teams because that's the gold standard. That's what other people don't get. So if you're looking at your team, if you don't have a non-conference schedule that's good and with good wins, that's going to come back potentially to keep you out of the tournament.
And like we've talked about before, is the discussion of whether or not you can construct that schedule. Let's say people don't want to play you. I mean, that's not a factor. That is what it is. I mean, no one gets to come to the committee and say, we tried, we called these schools and they wouldn't play us. All you can evaluate is the schedule that was played.
Correct, 100%. And the reason why they couldn't, and I'm somewhat sympathetic for the nobody will play me argument, except I'm in a league and have had a program that would experience some of that. There are teams that will play you. We get kind of tired of playing each other, if we're honest, but it's why Augustana probably played Oshkosh, is they probably found themselves in a situation 2 years ago where it was hard to get a game scheduled, so they play each other. The one that the committee struggles with, but there's nothing we can do about it, is a geographic problem. So some of those teams out in West California, certain teams in Texas or the South, they have a tough time finding teams outside of their conference to play. And so that's difficult. The criteria doesn't allow us to care very much, but personally, I get that. That's hard, but there's nothing we can do about it. The criteria doesn't have a way to factor that in.
From a committee standpoint, not talking from a standpoint of how people schedule, but when you guys have games that pit a regionally ranked team from one region versus another, those become gold for you as a data point, right? I mean, I'm thinking, so December 30th, Illinois Wesleyan and Yeshiva, that like the implications of that result is enormous, but it's a huge data point for you to have.
Correct. And what I would say is the winner of that game is going to have a value many teams in the rest of the country won't have. But what I would like to tell coaches is that loss is not as drastic as people perceive it to be. Because if you go through it, Bob, you're going to have the ability to have 5, 6, 7, 8 losses and still be in the mix if you've played a good schedule. And so the criteria affords a good loss. The one thing I would add, what isn't in the criteria, Bob, really is no way to measure a bad loss, right? I mean, a bad loss there is no such thing other than the win-loss percentage and the SOS, which would already be impacted by any loss. There really isn't but that team was 387 in the RPI, that doesn't matter. So you're really better off going ahead and trying to play good people and trying to get the quality win than it is being afraid of a loss. You've got to get regionally ranked wins and you've got to get SOS points. That's just the simple simple fact of the matter is. And if you're not good enough to win those games, you're probably not an NCAA tournament team anyway. So
great points. Very clear, the message around you need to play good teams and you need to win some games, right? Now let's clarify before we move on how many teams will be in this year's tournament. I had the last manual I have is 1920, obviously, and that was a 64 team tournament. That was 43 pool A's, 1 pool B, and 20 pool C's. We can talk through what each of those are. Are we still at a 64 team field this year? And what's the breakdown between A, B, and C, if you would, Mike?
Yeah, 64 team field. It will be 44 automatic qualifiers and 20 pool C's. We do not have enough teams that are independents for them to have a pool B.
And so when we talk about pool A, we're talking about the 44 winners of conference automatic bids. And most of those conferences, I think all but one, that is settled in a conference tournament. In one of them, the UAA, there is no conference tournament. Old school, the winner of the regular season. I think that's 43 have conference tournaments. Is that correct, Mike?
I don't know. The one new one, which is a bit more of a national one, I'm not actually sure if they are going to have a conference tournament or not. They've got teams all across the country as well. I'm actually not sure.
That's right. Like the coast to coast conference or whatever. Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
And then the 20, what we call pool C, another word for that would be the at large. So right. when we talk about like who's going to get an at large bid, AKA pool C. So 44 and 20, we have a 64 team field. Let's talk about regional rankings now a little bit, and this will get into an interesting conversation about a change to the first ranking. Now, usually in the past, and I'm going to use 1920 as my last example, there were 3 men's basketball regional rankings and then a final one on what I'll call Selection Sunday. So February 12th, we were all excited. It was probably, I think those are Tuesdays. February 12th, the regional ranking came out. February 19th, and February 25th. And then there is a final Selection Sunday, which maybe a day later we end up seeing, which is nice. So talk us through the timing. And if you don't have dates, that's okay. But how do regional rankings work now in 21-22?
Yeah, so very similar to that. I do have dates. So I'll give you the dates that we'll do them. We will do our for those who don't know, we always do a practice ranking. I bring that up because it'll become part of a conversation we'll have here in a minute. We do a practice ranking in which really the essence is to make sure everybody understands the criteria, candidly, Bob, to make sure the technology works, that the NCAA information gets to the national committee members, that our voting process works, that the numbers are correct, all of that, and just to make sure that there are no bugs in the system. Typically there aren't, but it is good to just sort of have a warm-up one. That practice ranking will be February 1st. So that'll be the practice ranking, which you won't see, we won't publicize, but it'll be done and will have no value, meaning it's not like we use it for the next week. It is a practice ranking to sort of get the bugs out, but we don't pay much attention to it going forward. The first national ranking will be February 8th then, which is the thing I'd point out here, Bob, that's a Tuesday. Traditionally, it's been on a Wednesday. We've moved it back a day. So our RAC calls, and for those who don't know, that the regional, the RAC, which there are 10 of them, represented by coaches in each of those 10 regions, they will do their regional rankings first and present it to the national committee on the Mondays. And then on Tuesday, the national committee gets together and actually, using that information, formulates the regional rankings. We've moved those back a day, as opposed to, it used to be Tuesday was the RAC call, Wednesday was the national call. And the reason, Bob, which will be consistent with what we'll talk about, why we proposed the alphabetical ranking, is in an effort to make those rankings more authentic, more accurate, more consistent. When we did national calls on Wednesday, as you'll know, we might be comparing North Central and Illinois Wesleyan on Wednesday.
Right.
And they may have played the night before, you know, that sort of stuff. And you knew what the ranking was going to look like the next week, but you couldn't use it. And so in an effort to eliminate that Tuesday night game influencing it or kind of skewing the rankings that come out publicly the next day, we've moved them back a day. That does not eliminate all games.
Just saying that the Tuesday is a heavy schedule day in Division III, and Monday is not. So that's
and so we don't completely eliminate that, Bob, but it eliminates much of it. I would say 80+% of those problems where people know you've got a result on Tuesday night, So now the regional ranking will come out nationally on Tuesday. And it actually, what it'll do, the excitement of that is those Tuesday night games now will carry more weight publicly. So those of you that are fans will go, wow, hey, Tuesday night, we've got, Williams Amherst, whatever that's taking place. Well, here's where they are in the rankings. Boy, that game's going to be big. And so I think it'll add a little bit of excitement. So we've moved that back. So the first regional ranking will be the 8th. The second will be the 15th of February. The third will be the 22nd. And then the 27th will be the last national ranking with the selections show coming out on Monday, the 28th of February. That's the timeline.
Gotcha. Okay. So very similar timeline, except for the moving it up from Wednesdays to Tuesdays, which I agree, because it always did seem weird when that would come out and there'd be this huge data set all across the country. And then the rankings are like a day late. So that's a great call. Now let's get into this alphabetical ranking topic. And kind of off the air, we started some conversation about this in the last week, because I think football, which is, one of the most popular sports out there, but other sports, right, are using this alphabetical ranking. It is, as I understand, it's a trial. This isn't a set in stone thing. And I'm just going to tee it up and say, I believe the idea is for the first ranking, which for you, men's basketball, is February 8th. Instead of that being an actual 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, it will be the list of teams that are regionally ranked, but in no ranking order, just alphabetical. Talk through the why, everything you think people need to understand this alphabetical ranking.
Yeah. So first of all, and what gets attached to that's accurately described, Bob, is that the idea came from the men's basketball committee. That's true. It did come from us. And the reason we proposed it is really simple. And that is that first regional ranking we put out is missing, as a result of how the criteria works, it's missing a primary criteria data point completely, because the first regional ranking creates results against regionally ranked opponents. And so what always felt very odd to me, Bob, is you would do this regional ranking, you would put them in order. And the moment you put them in order, you recognized it was wrong. Because as soon as you create the data point of regionally ranked wins, which we've already talked about is a huge data point, it's something that not very many people get, is you would look at a region and go, well, we have team A as the third team in this region. But now that we've done the regional rankings, they wouldn't even be ranked because they don't have a regionally ranked win, that sort of thing. And so the example I would use is it felt like doing a numeric ranking of teams prior to having all the data points from the primary criteria available is the equivalent of trying to bake cookies without all the ingredients and then telling you all these are cookies. You would be able, it was inauthentic to me. It was insufficient, incomplete, inaccurate, a little bit deceptive, because on the committee, we knew these weren't accurate, and we actually knew internally how we would have ranked them. And so I feel like until you have all the data, Bob, it's the order matters immensely, right? What order we have these teams in is incredibly important and carries a ton of weight. And so I don't think we should put them in order numerically and recognize that team A is thus more deserving of an at-large bid at this point in this juncture than team B until we have the entirety of the data point. So it's just that simple. We're not trying to hide something. We're not trying to make it easier for the committee. It's really an effort to say, the truthful answer, Bob, is the first regional ranking, I can't tell you what the order is until we have all the criteria. That's the truthful answer. And I actually don't think we should until we have all of it. So you may have questions. The critiques I've heard are two. The first one would be, we've lost a week of regional rankings. So why not use the practice ranking week sort of as a pre-ranking week? And I actually really like that idea. So let me say that I don't know if we didn't think of it. I didn't think of it. If it was proposed and the rest of the country may not do it exactly like men's basketball, I don't know the answers to that, because obviously this has a national implication. Men's basketball can't do something everybody else can't do. So I would actually like that idea. I like the idea of the practice ranking becoming a pre-ranking, and we release that one alphabetically in sort of an officially unofficial way, but then we use those teams for the first ranking to include regionally ranked wins. Dave McHugh suggested that in a phone call. Charlie Brock from Springfield suggested it to me in a phone call. I think that's an outstanding middle ground. And if anybody cares what I think it's what we should do going forward. I really think for men's basketball, that would be the best and cleanest way for us to both rank the first time numerically with all the criteria and get rid of this feeling that we're taking a ranking away, which was never the intent. It was never the intent, but it's an intent to get it right sooner and more often, with the only goal, Bob, the only goal the committee has is that we get the right 20 teams in based on criteria. I think waiting to rank numerically until we have all the criteria increases the likelihood that that happens. That's my opinion. The second critique that I've heard is that we are doing an internal ranking 1 through 8 for Region 8, for example, but not releasing it. And that would be truthy, if that makes sense. So there is an internal ranking numerically that we will do, but not that we're not we're going to use it without telling you. The answer is I don't know if we're going to have 8 teams, we've got to have some way to establish there's a 9th team. And why didn't the 9th team get in? You've got to have a numeric ranking to decide who the 8 are that get in. So there is a ranking that gets done, because at some point you've got to compare the 8th team with the 9th team and decide who gets to get in and who doesn't. But that ranking will not be used going forward, but it is the only way to get to 8 teams. So people have heard that, and it's true, but not deceptive. We're not going to use that and not tell you. In reality, we gave you a numerical ranking in the past and didn't really follow it. That's the more accurate way. So that's why we did it. We'll see if it goes forward. It may not a big deal to me if it doesn't. My personal opinion is it's better and cleaner, particularly if we add the pre-ranking week in what is currently the practice week.
So and that's awesome stuff. And this is going to help people tremendously, but just to recap. So you've got these 5 primary selection criteria, and then you've got some secondary. And as you're doing the first regional ranking, one of the criterion, the results versus regionally ranked, one of them, which is very important, it can't be factored into the first ranking because regional rankings don't exist. So in the past, you were releasing a first regional ranking, which didn't include that. And so you'd put it in order. You'd have your 1 through 8 in a region, but in essence, it was not accurate, because then you put it out there and you say, oh, geez, we didn't factor in that Benedictine beat DePauw. And all of a sudden we're looking at this and we're like, we wouldn't have ranked it this way had we been able to factor that. So you move to this notion that, yes, we need to come up with the ranked teams using the rest of the criteria. So winning percentage and SOS and head-to-head, all those things. But you're just going to do them alphabetically. So here's the teams that we decided we should rank based on everything except the regionally ranked. And then starting in week 2, you get to go back and look at all 10 of these regions and apply that criteria, thinking that the first numerical ranking is now way more accurate than the first ever could be. Is that correct?
That is 100% the reason, and there's no other.
Gotcha.
I just think the first time we put it in order and we say team A is thus more deserving than team B, we put it in numerical order, it should have all the criteria available.
And then literally the only feedback that I've heard that I thought was, that fair and that I agreed with, and your second one, I guess I'd heard that too, but the one I agree with is, look, as a fan, as a media guy, whatever, like, I hate losing. You love the day when you get that first regional ranking. So in this case, February 8th, this just means that there's another week. Now we get into mid-February before you actually get a numerical. And so the point of, can't the committee do the practice ranking and get their stuff together and do that as the alphabetical, do the practice ranking in January if you need to. And what you're saying is you agree with that. And if that is something that's supported by others, like, you're all in on doing the practice ranking as the alphabetical.
Correct. And to use Dave McHugh's term, when I talked to him on the phone, it becomes a pre-ranking instead of a practice ranking. It's, in essence, we're doing a ranking so that we can accurately do the first ranking. I think that's a great idea. And Bob, the concern would be, is that too much work for the committee? I can only speak for men's basketball. We could do our practice ranking as a pre-ranking most years. We could. You could do it, and it's not more work. It's not another day. we just release the practice ranking in alphabetical order and call it a pre-ranking, we could absolutely do it. And I think that makes a ton more sense. And I don't think it's any extra work. I don't think we're releasing information we shouldn't release. I think it makes a lot of sense. That's my I'm now speaking as Mike Schauer. But if anybody cares, that would be my opinion as well. I think that makes a lot of sense.
And then your second concern that you said you heard out there a little bit in some chatter is just that like they're hiding something from us. The process is not transparent. But I think your point is maybe in the past, by releasing a regional ranking that was missing such a huge data point, that was the misleading ranking. That
would be my view on it, that actually we were almost misleading you the other way, because we were giving you information 1 through 8. So we were giving you more information that was less accurate. Now we're giving you less information that is more accurate. So I don't know which one of those is more or less transparent. You can decide that. I would rather have accurate information as opposed to more information that's not as accurate. The thing about the transparency, Bob, because I've heard that for a long time, you will affirm that I actually reached out to you asking to hop on the podcast and go, hey, I would love to do this. I don't think we're dealing with national security information here. It's regionally ranked teams of Division III basketball. So I am completely available. I'll hop on a call with you anytime you want. If you go, why did the committee do this? You have my cell phone. You're welcome to give it out to anybody. I am always available. The only thing you won't get from me is direct conversations. I won't tell you what Chuck McBreen said or Sarah said or Mort said. I won't say that. And I won't tell you the votes, meaning we don't always agree on the committee either. So I won't say the vote was 6-4. I won't give you that information. But if the answer is why was North Central ahead of Benedictine, I'll answer that. Anytime anybody wants to ask me, this is not national security information. I have no desire to hide anything. There's no reason to.
And not only is your approach appreciated by everyone, the transparency and how this plays out, but if you look back over the last 10, 15, 20 years, the way we got to the point we are right now with this criteria and how this works is because there have been discussions within committees such as the one you're having that have improved things. If you look at like how Pool C is constructed today and those primary criteria, it is way better than it was 10 years ago. I can't even remember what was the QOWI, and these things that have changed for a reason, and they will continue to. They'll continue to. So I think the one thing the committee has proven is that you're pretty darn adaptable to great ideas that come in and implementing them rather quickly. So, I mean, when you look back, maybe in the period of time where you said you were more the squeaky wheel, you'd have to acknowledge it is so much better than it was 10 years ago.
No question. There's no question. And Bob, the reason for that is we have gotten to the point that we are trying to follow the criteria and only the criteria and not additional conversation, additional data points. And I always use this as an example, Bob. I said this to you when we talked several months ago. What I love about our criteria, there are things I don't like about the criteria, but what I love about it is consistent and transparent enough that somebody like yourself, who is an outsider to the 10-member committee, but can pick 16, 17, 18 of our 20 at-large bids, we can agree on them because the criteria is so clear. And yet it isn't so numeric, so rote, that we can still disagree on 3-4 of them every year and discuss that. So there is the need for the committee. So it's both and. I really like that part of it. It's clear enough that somebody can get to and go, well, I can tell you who these teams are going to be, and yet not so just rote, just so
Right.
numeric, systemic, that we can disagree and debate. I just think that part I really like.
It's a really good point. Anyone that follows this extremely closely can probably almost get maybe 18 of the 20 right. And what's good though is that when you get the bracket that day we all love, and you're watching, like, oh my God, they went with this team and this team as 19 and 20. And so you like that there is flexibility in the criteria for people to have those discussions. Completely agree. Final topic for you has to do with bracketing, and we won't spend a ton of time on this, but I want people to understand and have you talk about the fact this is not the Division I bracket, where Gonzaga can play North Carolina in round 1. So you don't get to usually say like Pomona Pitzer can go play Tufts. There is a lot of constraint around geography that all has to do with finances at the Division III tournament level. Just high level, talk about the challenge, the realities of making the bracket and the geography implication.
Yeah. So, I mean, in essence, it is a money constraint. We are limited by the number of flights we can do. And so, and I don't know if people follow this, but they've actually upped the distance from 500 miles to 600 miles that we can travel via bus without a flight. And that helps moderately, although that's a long ways via bus. But so anything that is beyond that has to be a flight. And so we are limited, broadly speaking, to 5 flights. That's not an absolute, because it's hard to, you can't guarantee that's going to happen depending upon results as the tournament moves forward. But it does mean in opening rounds, you are not going to be able, you don't want to burn very many of those flights because you're going to probably need them later on. So the opening rounds get regionalized a little bit. I think in recent years, Bob, we've done about as well as you can do. We work very hard. And Sam Atkinson, my predecessor, was phenomenal at this, is trying to make sure that you are not having conference opponents play early on, if at all possible, and trying to have multiple regions represented in each pod. So we took a lot of pride in the times we could get 3 regions represented in a pod, as opposed to only 2, those sorts of things. So we're spending a lot of time trying to make it as national as possible, but the constraints financially make it impossible. You actually can't do it. So there is not a true seeding in our tournament of 1 through 16 and those types of things that you see at Division I, because you've got to try to figure out who can play against those top teams. We try to give the top teams home games and hosting, if at all possible. But it then means if you say, hey, St. John's is your host, those of you that want to follow along, you're going to go, all right, within 500 to 600 miles of St. John's is probably the 3 teams that are going to go there. And you can start to kind of figure out how that's going to look. So we try to do it as best we can, Bob, but it's not an absolute national tournament because of that. There is a regionalized process to it.
And that's important for everyone to understand. It's just kind of a Division III bracketing 101 is you're not going to get a bracket where you can look at the first seed and the 64 seed. They're given 5 flights or a certain amount of flights. Typically, Mike just said 5, and they have to stay within that. They don't want to use flights in early rounds if they can avoid it. Sometimes maybe it makes sense to use one in an early round in certain situations.
And in certain situations you have to, Bob, but right. And it's really those Northwest teams and Texas. Those are, if you look at traditional brackets, you often have, Whitman, Whitworth, those teams that are isolated in the Northwest, or some teams in Texas. There aren't a lot of teams within 600 miles who are not conference opponents. So that often is a first round flight. Or historically, that's been a first round flight, but you try to limit to that if you can.
I should know this, but when you say 5 flights, does that include the flights necessary to get to Fort Wayne?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's basically a broad, it's a budget. It's not necessarily an absolute. So we're not as worried about once we get to Fort Wayne, but if we have burned 7 flights by the time we get to Fort Wayne, that's not going to make us real popular, because that means we're way over budget. And so, Bob, you're not only looking at those first round games, but you're trying to anticipate the what ifs. What if these teams advance? Where are our Sweet 16 games going to be? Can we get teams to there? So it is a very, very lengthy process that takes, if I'm really honest, Bob, after we've picked the teams, the amount of time we spend in Indianapolis putting that bracket together is longer than you might imagine. It is a very tedious process, because you've got to kind of try to guess as best you can, hey, worst case scenario, how many flights are we going to create here if this goes sideways on us? So you do have to try to take some of that in consideration. There is a budget involved here.
I can't even imagine the bracketing side. I tried it 1 year. It's been about 8 years. Me and former Illinois Wesleyan assistant coach Steinbrook had a paper map, and we had push pins. Well, that's your
problem. If you get him involved, you have no chance.
Yeah, I'm not saying I picked a good partner, but this is what was going on. We had push pins for every team that we thought was in, and making the bracket and trying to avoid the flights. It was so difficult that I was like, it's not even worth me trying to do this again. I'm stopping at the pool C's, and then they can figure that out. It's hard.
There's a software that helps us. I will tell you, Sam was unbelievable. If you look at the brackets he put together the last couple of years, and if you look at the teams that were left at the Sweet 16 when the tournament was canceled in 2020, it's a remarkable bracket. And
It
for
is.
those of us who know what goes into that, it's really almost a piece of artwork to us, right? We just marvel at how well he put that together. So that will be honestly my biggest challenge for sort of coming after him is actually the bracket. That's going to be, I am not as good at that as he was.
And what Mike's referring to is if you look at those 16 teams that were sitting there, you had North Central playing WashU, right? That's a bus. You had Wittenberg was playing Mount Union, I believe. You had Yeshiva and Randolph-Macon, which was a bus. You had to fly Pomona Pitzer to Elmhurst. You can't avoid that. But if you look at all of those matchups, amazing job by that 1920 committee in putting that together in a way that fits all the criteria. Pretty cool.
It still gives us a truly quality tournament.
Final question, just any impact? I know COVID is like hit the rest of the world, has hit Division III financially. Any financial fallout from the last couple years regarding the Division III tournament and bracketing and flights and all that stuff?
No, the only place you'll see it is less financial than it is across the board. So traditionally at the Final Four, there has been a banquet for all the teams. That will not happen, but that is more of a COVID safety issue than it is a budgetary issue. We're talking about ways to kind of supplement that for the teams that get to the Final Four. I will tell you in 2019, that was a really unique and special experience to be able to have a banquet that included all 4 teams. It included the NABC All-Star guys. It was a really neat and special experience to be in a room with all those teams and kind of celebrate the success of getting here, to get in that moment. That will not happen across the country. And that's really more not getting several hundred people together in a room who are about to go play each other and just trying to make sure that we don't have transmission right before tip off. And so some of those events won't happen as they have in the past, but in terms of the cost of it, it is roughly the same.
Well, Mike, I really appreciate the time, and I'll make a final comment. I'll ask you to then close us out. People look at this back to 20, 30 years ago and think that the committee is like in a dark room, smoking cigars, figuring out through the good old boys network how to pick the teams. And that's not where we are. I can tell you that this interview happened because Mike texted me last week and said, hey, maybe we should get on a QCast and talk about the criteria and the alphabetical ranking. I'm seeing some chatter. So we are 180 degrees away from the dark room and the cigars. And I think on behalf of everyone, Mike, we appreciate you and your committee and how transparent you have been and will continue to be. Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to turn it over to you and close us out if you would.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Bob. That would be one of my prime. I have 2 objectives as the chair. One is to get the right 20 teams in, right? That according to the criteria, we take that responsibility very, very seriously. And there is not very much politicking that goes on in our committee. I will tell you, I will try to eliminate all of it. I'm not interested in guys trying to defend their region or that sort of stuff. We're trying to get the most deserving 20 teams in, and based upon the criteria, that would be one. The other goal is that I'm as transparent as I can be. So, Bob, when the rankings come out on Tuesdays, if you want to hop on a call with me, I'm available. If my number's posted, my email's available. People can reach out to me. This is a honor of a lifetime. I have loved serving on this committee. Being chair of the committee is really the greatest honor of my professional life, and something I enjoy as much as anything I've ever done. And the last thing I would want to do is people to think that I'm in a room someplace trying to manipulate the process to the benefit of my team, my league, my region. And so one of the best ways to keep that from happening is to make sure people ask questions. So if you've got questions, reach out to Bob. He's got my cell number. He'll give it to you. I'm willing to talk about it. The only thing I can't talk about is what was said, but I'll tell you why we voted a certain way. This just doesn't feel, that would be really important to me, Bob. So I would like to leave the committee more transparent. I thought we've been very transparent and just be very open. I love what we do and want to get it right.
Kudos to you, Mike, and your team. Thank you from everyone that cares about Division III basketball like so many of us do. Mike Schauer's team is ranked 6th. We haven't spent time on them. We will another time. You open Wednesday against Benedictine. I will be rooting for a Wheaton win because I need some of these common opponent things and things you were talking about. So I wore my orange. It's non-conference season. I'm going to be rooting for the Wheaton Thunder. Mike, thanks so much for your time, and we will talk very soon.
Thanks, Bob.